I just bounce up and ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you very much for coming on this wet afternoon. And can I just say to the Oakland School pupils, yes, I know it's an afternoon of many activities, football matches, other talks, this, that and the other. So thank you very much for making the effort. I'm particularly grateful that you're here, so I can welcome a former pupil of mine, Lottie Brand, and in a moment Andy from the sixth form will make a formal introduction. I just had a few announcements. First of all, I think you've all seen this, so you can see where we are in the term. I'm sorry the upper school trip, we couldn't do it, just can't get the tickets from the Royal Society, so we couldn't do that. Next week is the IB 6 Group 4 project. There is another BioSoc lecture this term. I've had to change the date, so when you look in the red book, I've had to swap it with chemistry, as noted on that piece of paper. And some of the other things, I just wanted to mention that it all looks very medical and all the rest of it. Anyone here, anyone doing biology, is welcome to attend any of those things. So just ask me, it might be relevant to your interests, you never know. Next week, I just want to draw your attention to something that the sixth form DocSoc people probably would not like your attention drawn to. We're doing something slightly different in DocSoc. It's called Healthcare in the News. And the sixth form DocSoc pupils have volunteered to give 5-minute talks on areas connected with the NHS, with science and in ethics. The task is to do it with no notes. Now again, you're all welcome to attend, subject to the normal permissions. This is the sort of event where you can come in and out. And Harrington School is only one building, so it should be easy to get in. Anyway, any questions, see me. This evening's talk is very, very topical, and I'm delighted to also welcome a representative from the 7th Form Girls Matthews Society, and I think the topic for this evening should stimulate some very useful discussion. I'd like to now ask Andy Aitken from the 6th Form to come and do an introduction. Come to the front, please.
Our talk today is going to be given by Dr. Charlotte Brand on the evolution of sex differences in humans. She is an old Oakhamian, so yeah, school spirit. She did her undergraduate degree at UCL in human sciences. She did her master's at St. Andrews in evolutionary and comparative psychology, her PhD in sex difference and social learning at St. Andrews. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Charlotte Brand.
And thanks Dr. Nicola for inviting me. It's really nice to be back and also very strange with all of my previous biology teachers in the audience. So today I'm going to be talking about generally the evolution of sex differences in behaviour, as this is what a lot of my PhD revolved around, and I will be including one of the studies I did in my PhD, but if you don't quite follow that, because it's a bit of a strange one, then the general gist of how we talk about and interpret sex differences is the main thing I want to get through to you today. So first of all, very broadly, why did sex even evolve in the first place? It's actually a bit of an interesting question, because if natural selection is all about passing on your genes, then why pass on only half of your genes? Why not just keep passing on all of your genes, as is the case in asexual reproduction? So the fact that you actually forfeit half of your genes by reproducing sexually means that there must be a pretty good or pretty big benefit to doing so from an evolutionary perspective. So I quite like this is one of the hypotheses, the Red Queen hypothesis. I'm a fan of this because I quite like Alice in Wonderland anyway. And it just comes from the quote, "You have to run as fast as you can to stay in the same place," which basically relates to the idea that variation is really important. So if you're mixing up half of your genes with half of someone else's, then you have more variation to kind of use. If there's a change in the environment or if there's something else that you're trying to respond to, then it's more likely that you'll have kind of something in the mix if you're constantly varying your genetic makeup. And this relates to all sorts of other evolutionary arms races. So for example, between predator and prey, if you're a predator and you're constantly getting better and better at catching your prey, then the prey also has to evolve and constantly get better and better and better to account for this. So that's one of the possible theories. But what about how do we actually become male and female developmentally as humans? This isn't an area of expertise for me, but I'm just going to give a really kind of broad picture that I learned in my undergrad. So it is something to do with this SRY gene, which is on the Y chromosome. This is responsible for the development of the male fetus. So if you think of it in terms of you've got your genetic sex, your chromosomes, these genes are expressed developmentally, which causes your gonadal sex to develop, which then leads to hormone secretion, and that then leads to your phenotypic or your external body and how you appear and what your sex appears to be. And you may be familiar with an HPA axis already, but you may not, but you don't really need to follow. It's just the idea that you've got your hypothalamus in the brain and the pituitary. These send signals to each other, which then get sent on to the adrenal cortex and sent on to various target organs, such as gonads. And there are feedback loops from these target organs back up to the brain, the pituitary gland, and that this system is constantly feeding back and checking levels of hormones and all these kinds of things. So I'm going to talk a little bit next about what can happen when this system goes wrong. So yeah, just to highlight that this whole system relies on functioning receptors, enzymes, and things that you're probably really familiar with. So this next slide is a bit busy. I'm sorry, it is the busiest one of the talk. But I really wanted to give some of these examples because I found them really, really helpful when thinking about sex and behaviour and men and women, to always kind of bear these instances in mind. So there's one particular disorder called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and essentially the feedback loops that I was just talking about are affected in this disorder so that the pituitary gland doesn't receive a stop signal. This means that there's an overload in androgens, so the male hormones, and if it's a female individual, their external genitalia receive estrogens, so female and male hormones at the same time, and this means that their genitalia become virilized. And virilized just means that it's kind of ambiguous as to whether they're male or female. This often results in corrective surgery at birth, so these individuals go through surgery to correct their genitalia so they look more female. But of course, during this whole developmental process, the hormones are also affecting your brain. Your brain are receiving these same hormones and signals. And so there are some reports that these individuals, although female, actually claim that they feel like a boy a lot of the time, and they may sometimes display boy-typical play behaviour, and they may be more likely to be attracted to women. Obviously there's a lot of controversy around some of these claims, but it has been reported. There's also complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, so this is actually where the receptors on the target cells aren't present for androgens. So for men, or for males, week 7 masculization usually begins, but for these individuals, the males go on to develop female external genitalia despite having a Y chromosome. So they're genetically male, but the adults look female, and they have internal testes which are undescended, where the ovaries usually would be. And this is complete insensitivity syndrome, but there's also medial and partial MAIS and partial AIS too. And then the last one, 5-ARD deficiency. This is just a genetic enzyme defect, which means that testosterone can't be metabolized. So individuals are born female, but they have internal testes, and then at puberty become a boy, or their testes descend at puberty. And there's an interestingly high incidence of this in the Dominican Republic and in Papua New Guinea. So there's actually a BBC documentary about this not so long ago. And interestingly, in Dominican Republic, when the individuals become a boy, it's really celebrated, and they think this is great, and they all have a celebration. And the individuals are called huevadoches, which literally means eggs at 12, or testes, it's another word for testes. However, in Papua New Guinea, where there's another high incidence of this, the individuals are shunned. So some interesting different responses to these disorders. And the reason I'm telling you about this generally is just to really, really highlight that even before we've taken into account the environment and culture and everything that happens kind of outside your biology, if you want to think of it that way, biological sex in and of itself isn't actually that straightforward. There's not always a really straightforward correlation between chromosomes, gonads, and external phenotype. And the brain is involved in this process. The brain is receiving hormones and everything as well. So when we're thinking about variation in individuals, female typical, male typical, physiology and behaviour and things, it's important to bear this is a very complicated process even from a biological perspective. So when we talk about sex differences, what do we mean? What is a sex difference? So one very straightforward one is just your gender identification. If you're genetically male, you are more likely to say, I identify as a male, and vice versa if you're female. Obviously not all the time, but mostly. Height. So height is a really useful one to bear in mind as an example, because we all know that on average men are taller than women, but we obviously all know women who are taller than men, so it's not a hard and fast rule. And same thing applies to all other behavioural sex differences. So there are reports of sex differences in the kinds of toys girls and boys like to play with as infants. This is also still highly debated, whether that's to do with how parents are encouraging boys and girls to play with different toys, or whether it's a biological innate desire. Again, debated, same with levels of aggression, emotional recognition, verbal fluency, so vocab and the size of an individual's vocab, and mental rotation, which is one that I'll talk about in a bit more detail later. But how different when we talk about these differences? So the next slide I've stolen from Professor Melissa Hines with her permission. She's an amazing researcher at Cambridge who specialises in testosterone and sex differences in behaviour. And she presented this at a conference, and I thought it was really cool. So essentially this graph is showing effect sizes, which you don't need to really understand what they are, but they're basically a standardised way of comparing differences that are found in different studies. So if one study finds that on this particular task men and women are different by this much, you compare that difference across all the studies, and this is just a comparable way of looking at this. So the units don't really mean anything. But if we look at the biggest one, that's gender identity. So as I said, that's quite a big difference. You say you're male or you say you're female. The next down is sexual orientation. So actually that's quite a big drop. The difference there is almost just over half the size. So you're not as likely to say that you're attracted to the opposite sex, even if you identify with that sex. And then picking out height again, there it has an effect size of 2. So if you imagine how often are men taller than women, that is represented by the effect size of 2, and half of that, or less than half, is this one there, refers to mental rotation ability, which I'm going to talk about more again later, but this mental rotation ability is one of the only robust cognitive sex differences that we have found in the scientific literature. And so it's important to bear in mind when we're talking about men and women having these different abilities, it's different by half the amount that men and women's height is different, if you follow that. So, okay, what about brains? You may have seen this particular scientific study was kind of splattered all over the media when it came out a few years ago. What happened was some scientists essentially imaged around 929 brains of individuals aged 8 to 22, and they found that males had greater within hemispheric connectivity, so the connections within the two hemispheres were stronger than between, and vice versa for females, so kind of represented in a cartoonish way. This isn't a real image on these. The top two would be the male typical brain, and the bottom two would be the female typical brain. There are quite a lot of problems with this particular study. I'm not going to go into detail in all of them, but one in particular that I'm going to focus on. The scientists also who were responsible for this study claimed that it supports the stereotypes, which is kind of a dangerous thing to say as a scientist. especially as the imaging study was purely an imaging study, so they didn't relate it to any functional behaviour. The individuals weren't performing any behaviours or tasks in the study. It was literally just looking at their brains. And we're assuming they're talking about a stereotype of women being multitaskers, men being specialists, perhaps, but it wasn't clear. So obviously the media loved that headline. But one of the main problems with the study that I have is that brains are plastic. So this is one of my favourite studies that I learned about at university, which is about taxi drivers. So they got London taxi drivers, who we all know have to, well, they don't now because of sat-nav, but back in the day, they'd memorise all these crazy little interconnected Soho streets and everything, and they'd have it all in their memory. And they found that taxi drivers' hippocampi, so a part of the brain that is particularly related to navigation, were bigger than controls. And they've now backed this up with various video games. So these images are taken from, they've now created at UCL a video game where you can kind of learn to be a taxi driver, and they've mimicked all of the London streets and everything. And so they've got people to do this in the lab and see the changes that happen in their brain as they get better and better at this task. So clearly experience and usage does alter the size and structure of different parts of the brain. As I said, London taxi drivers had enlarged areas of this particular area compared to controls. And clearly no one would argue that some people are born to be taxi drivers or they're born with a taxi driver's brain. Clearly what's going on here is that they have got better and better and better at this particular task, and that is reflected in the structure of their brain. So the fact that men and women's brains are structured differently, according to this one study, may probably be to do with the fact that men and women are behaving differently or doing different tasks in their day-to-day life, are interacted with differently, all sorts of things, but it doesn't mean that they were born with those differences, and it doesn't mean that they're genetically predetermined or it's innate. And that's one thing to think about. So back to this mental rotation task. You may recognise it if you've done kind of IQ tests and things like that. Essentially what you have to do is, if we take the top picture, you have to say, are those two shapes identical but one's been rotated, or are they different shapes altogether? So the top one, they're different shapes. The bottom one, that's the same shape, it's just rotated, if you can see that. And bizarrely, this is one of the only and most robust cognitive sex differences, in that men and boys tend to do better than women and girls. There are loads of different types of mental rotation tasks, but this is kind of the most common. And it is largely responsible for the claim that men are better at spatial tasks than women. So whenever you see men are better at navigation, spatial tasks, this, that and the other, it nearly always boils down to just one of these mental rotation tasks in particular. It is still controversial. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of scientific studies and papers looking at this particular task, and particularly looking at what causes the difference between men and women. And also I've put here meta-analyses, which is probably a weird term that you might not be familiar with, but basically once there are hundreds of scientific studies all looking at one thing, usually a bunch of people will get together and be like, well, let's look at all of the data together and see if we can find out any patterns and what's going on here. And in this case, there are even about 10 or 12 different meta-analyses just particularly looking at whether men and women are different at this task and why. So it's really controversial, it's hotly debated, it's very strange, it seems very odd. Why would this evolve? Like, why would men need to be good at this and not women but nothing else? It seems like a very strange thing. So there's lots of different theories put forward. One is the hunter-gatherer hypothesis, which claims that in our evolutionary past, men went out hunting while women remained at camp and foraged locally. And that this difference explains it because men are hunting for large mammals with spears and they're having to, spatially rotate things, apparently, and women aren't doing that. But there are quite a few problems with this hypothesis. It's not a very largely held hypothesis. Not many people would claim this as the answer, but it is one that exists out there that is linked to evolution. The main problem with this argument is which hunter-gatherers are you talking about and when do you mean? Because hunter-gatherers, there are many, many, many different cultural groups of hunter-gatherers alive today, and why do we think that one particular group reflects our evolutionary past any more than any other? And even if we do want to focus on that particular part of our evolutionary past, why are we focusing on that? And there's plenty of evidence that we have had genetic mutations and evolution has occurred genetically in the past 5,000 years, which is much more recent. And actually there's evidence that we've had evolutionary change happen in the brain in the past 5,000 years. And also, why not before then? Why wasn't there something really significant that happened before our hunter-gatherer evolutionary stage, which is really important and still holds true today? So focusing all our efforts on this hunter-gatherer part of our past is a commonly done thing in a lot of evolutionary psychology, but people are trying to move away from it a lot more now because it's a big oversimplification of our evolution. Another thing is the particular study that claims this hypothesis explains the sex difference also used the mental rotation task in what it claims to be a huge cross-cultural sample, so you're testing it in lots of different cultures. However, when you look at the paper, they actually got their data from a BBC online survey, so their different cultures clearly had access to the internet and clearly could log on to some BBC forum, so not as cross-cultural or hunter-gathering as we would expect based on their hypothesis. So what else could be going on with these mental rotation tasks? Many, many things are listed as potential factors. So one, as I mentioned earlier, the kind of toys that boys and girls play with tend to differ. So boys do play with a lot of, either through their own desire or through other people encouraging them. They do tend to play with Lego and bricks and building blocks and things a lot more than girls, which could explain their mental rotation ability differences. Perhaps video games, perhaps there are certain video games that boys play more than girls that include this kind of mental rotation type skill that could be having an effect. There's one theory claims that actually testosterone, a byproduct of testosterone is just having these spatial skills. So they've done a lot of experiments with rats and mice with different levels of testosterone, and they find that their spatial skills, obviously they weren't doing mental rotation tasks that are rat equivalent, they were better at. And also the type of test, so how you describe the test, the way you kind of frame the test to participants, the where it's given, when it's given, all these kinds of things also have an effect on how big the difference is. And one that I focused on a lot during my PhD was confidence. So men and women do differ a lot in their levels of confidence, confidence also affects conformity, which is something I can talk about later if we have time. So I'm just going to go through some of the things that I found during my PhD through a huge search of the literature in sex differences in confidence. Things that appear to be robust and come up again and again, unfortunately, is that women do have lower confidence than men in the workplace and in cognitive tasks. Males rate their intelligence higher than females do, and this is found in 12 different nations. Girls have lower confidence than boys throughout their education, and this includes areas such as maths, spatial skills, biology, writing ability, and even medicine, despite evidence to the contrary. So this is referring to one particular study where doctors who were recently qualified were given feedback on their performance, as they usually were, and the women were actually performing better than the men. And even after they were given their individual feedback, women were rating their performance a lot lower than men were. So it's a really kind of robust and strange thing that's going on. Yeah, sorry, as I just said, it also predicts levels of conformity, so how likely women and men are to conform to the majority. Confidence plays a huge role in this, and that was a different part of my PhD that we can talk about later if I have time. But now I'm going to move on to sex differences in risk-taking. So across the animal kingdom, actually, there's often a sex difference in the male and female of fish, many species of fish, meerkats, lemurs, some rats, all sorts of different animals, in which the males tend to be bolder or more risk-taking than the females. And this is often linked to competition or testosterone and reproductive differences. So obviously a lot of the time the females are bearing the burden of reproduction, so So they have a lot to lose if they get themselves into kind of physical danger or ill health. It also affects potentially their offspring, whereas males, the offspring aren't so dependent on those, which is often the explanation for why that's the case in animals, or non-human animals, but in humans, how much this plays a part is debated. There is a sex difference in risk-taking in humans, in that men tend to have higher risk-taking preferences for things like economic risks, so gambling, physical risks such as extreme sports, and taking part in risky sport and that kind of thing. But obviously loads of other factors could be going on too. For example, societal and historical expectations. So the fact that men have always, been encouraged to go to war and do manual labour and all these things may have just, drifted along to today, to the point where that's more of a normal thing for a man to do than a woman. One study suggested that it might not be that men are more risk-taking than women, but that white men compared to everyone else are, purely because they're at the top, potentially, of a social hierarchy. They perceive less risk because if they go through a risky situation and they end up bearing a cost, then it's going to be less to them to regain that loss, and it's going to be easier for them to climb back up. So that's just some ideas. I'm going to talk about, in particular, a study that I did looking at risk-taking and social learning. So first of all, what is social learning? What do I mean by this term? So we mean the ability to learn a new behaviour from observing and or interacting with a conspecific or its products, so a member of your species, or the things that it's playing with. So if a chimpanzee wants to learn how to crack open a nut, instead of going all over the forest and trying all sorts of bizarre different things, if it sees another chimpanzee next to it cracking it open with a rock, it will then crack it open with a rock, and that would be social learning. And if you go on to... So it is present pretty much everywhere you look at it, from bees to fish to non-human primates. So if you go on to study animal behaviour or something, probably a lot of what you will end up studying is social learning. It's kind of swamping the literature at the moment as very interesting behaviour, and how a lot of animals learn and adapt to their environment. So you may have heard about the bumblebee waggle dance. That's where the bees go back to their nest and do a particular bizarre dance which does transmit information to the rest of the nest about where they've just been foraging. But recently they've also taught bees to pull string to retrieve a reward. So you can train a bumblebee to pull a string to get a reward, and then if other bumblebees see it doing it, it will also pull the string to get a reward. So bumblebees can learn socially from each other and imitate, apparently. Fish, there's tons and tons of experiments showing that fish learn different foraging and mating behaviours and things from each other. And obviously in non-human primates there are tons of studies with monkeys, chimpanzees, all different types of primates. They're really good social learners, they have really strong social groups and everything. So we're interested in social learning. The flip side to social learning is asocial learning, so learning on your own, so innovating, so doing something that neither you or any one of your species has done before. Defined as a solution to a novel problem or a novel solution to an old problem. So here we've got a crow. You may have seen this kind of stuff on TV. They can, having never seen it before, if they're given a tube with some water in it and a treat at the bottom, but they can't reach it, they'll drop stones in it to raise the water level until they can pull the treat out. They can do this without having seen another crow do it before, apparently. So we're interested in when and why do some individuals learn socially and some learn asocially, and do they switch between, because it's a trade-off and it's frequency dependent. So if you imagine that everyone in a social group is learning socially, then all of their information is the same and they're never going to get any new information from the environment. So if the environment changes, they're all stuck because they're all just doing the same thing. Similarly, it's very costly to reinvent the wheel again and again, so it's costly to do something brand new that you've not done before, and it's also costly to ignore what everyone else is doing that works and try and do your own different thing. So it could be a risky thing to learn asocially, which is where our experiment comes in. And yeah, as I said, but if you're all socially learning, you're vulnerable to change. So in our experiment, we were interested in whether a sex difference in risk-taking in humans also leads to a sex difference in social information use, or learning socially versus learning asocially, or innovating. So to do this, we designed an experiment which is based on building a spaceship, which is based on a board game called Galaxy Tracker, which, if you've not played it, it's really, really fun. This is less fun, but this just involves participants choosing 10 items out of crew, cargo, engines, shields, lasers. They've got 2 minutes to do so. They pick 10, put it on their ship, and they're told that they will get a bonus payment in money. This is students, so they're quite driven for the bonus payment if they achieve the top score, but they don't know how to achieve the top score on the ship. And they're given a choice between using social information or learning socially, or doing it on their own, learning asocially in the task. So after they've built their first ship, they're then shown this. Well done, your score was ranked 3rd, your ship was ranked 3rd, you got this score, and click continue to find out how you can improve your score. So next, they're shown, the next screen, they're given a choice, which is the choice between learning socially or asocially, depending on what condition they're in. So there are 3 conditions. The first one is where the asocial choice is risky and the social choice is safe, which I'll go through in a minute. The second condition is the opposite. The risky choice is social, the asocial choice is safe. And then there was a control condition where both of the options were entirely safe. So they would see this, and we're going to first talk about that they have these 2 options. They have as much time as they want to read through them, and they have to pick one. So we'll go through this one first. They're told you can go into the spaceship scrap heap. So this is the risky asocial option. You'll see lots of items you've not seen before, and some may greatly increase your ship's score. But depending on what you choose, your score could go up or down. So this is risky because they could hugely increase their score or hugely decrease. So they don't know what's going to happen. It's a gamble, essentially. In this one, this is a social option where they can look at other players' ships, and they're told that everyone's ship has either the same score as their own or slightly higher, and they're guaranteed to keep their score, or it can go up slightly. So this is safe because they can't lose anything. In the second condition, these are swapped over. So if you're seeing other people's ships, they could be terrible ships, they could be amazing ships, you don't know, your score could go up and down, it's a big gamble. And the asocial option, so rummaging in the scrap heap, is safe because all of the items are really good and they might help improve your ship, but they might not. And in the control condition, both of these are safe, you're never going to lose anything, your score will always remain the same or go up slightly. So what happened? We got 88 people to do this, and I'm going to talk you through this graph, but if you just focus on the circles and the triangles, so the triangles are male participants and the circles are female participants. On the x-axis here we have the 3 conditions, so the control, which you can already see, where it's safe to do either of the things. The middle is the social risky condition, where the social thing is the risky thing. And asocial risky is this final condition where the asocial thing is the risky thing. On the y-axis, we've got the proportion of people who chose the social thing to do. So 50% there, you can think of that as chance. That's sometimes they chose social, sometimes they chose asocial, not much difference. So here in the control condition, I think I've got that as well. So you can social at the top, on your own at the bottom, individual learning. So in the control condition, both men and women seem to be doing the asocial thing more often. They prefer to learn on their own, they prefer to rummage around in the scrap heap. Fine. In the social risky condition, that doesn't really change. They're both, men and women are both kind of like, yeah, probably asocial most of the time, more than chance. In the asocial risky condition, men are still pretty much choosing to do the asocial thing, and women are predominantly choosing to do the social thing. So, just to reiterate, everyone generally, it seems, prefers to do the asocial thing, except for women when it's a risky thing to do. However, men don't seem to change their behaviour based on the risk increasing. So what we conclude from this is that in our experiment with 88 students, women preferred to use social information when the asocial information was riskier. But of course this is context dependent. So it's not the case that women were always preferring to do the social thing, and it's not the case that men were always choosing to do the risky thing. So the way we would interpret it, and also, men's preference didn't change across the conditions. They always preferred asocial information. So we would interpret this as a threshold difference. So we found a place where men and women's threshold for risk is different. So in our risky condition, women thought, do you know what, that's a bit too much of a gamble, I'm going to go for the social option, whereas men were like, nah, I'm going to go for the gamble. So it wasn't risky enough to alter men's behaviour, but it did alter women's behaviour. So in this context, that's what we found. Perhaps if you changed the risk levels, you would find men and women behaving similarly. Perhaps if you made it even different, you might find that men and women behaving even more differently to each other. So the take-home message is, when we're talking about sex differences in behaviour, it's complicated. We like to think about spectrums and feedback loops. So this is one image that I found on the internet that when I first saw it, I was like, that's awful. And then I was like, actually, I kind of like it. Because if you think about biologically where you begin on this spectrum, things like your development, your environment, the activities you do, the feedback you get from your environment can push and pull you up and down the spectrum in different directions. So when you hear things like their brains are different, remember that brains can change based on how they're used throughout their life. And when you hear things like it's in the hormones, remember that hormones change based on activity, so going to the gym or having a baby raises and lowers men's testosterone respectively. And depending on your numbers of receptors and your enzyme functioning and all of these things, they all play a big role, so it's not black and white biologically. So think about where you start on the spectrum, how development affects it, and then how environment and culture affects it, and then that there's feedback loops going on as well. So the last thing I wanted to say was, remember height and homicide. So it's about averages. So we all know that some women are taller than men. If you're interested in this, I highly recommend you'll be able to follow this link. I think Dr. Nick is going to have the slides and he'll send them out to you if you want. This is a really amazing blog post on the Google Memos thing. I don't know if you heard about that in the news. Someone who works for Google sent a memo around saying that women are bad programmers, or the reason that women are not in programming as much is because they're biologically worse at programming, or something a bit bizarre. Obviously there was uproar all over the internet about this. And this is a really good blog post he did about it, which really goes through the stats very, very simply of how different men and women would have to be for it to be the case that there are more women hired by Google based on biology and all these kinds of things. It's really, really, really interesting and really accessible if you are interested. I would highly recommend that. So there's often a claim that women are too emotional to be scientists, so women are just, emotional, or they've got different brains, or however. But you don't often hear men are too homicidal to be surgeons, because actually the sex difference in homicide is huge. Men are way more likely to commit homicide than women. As likely, the sex difference there, you can see there's an effect size of 2. It's about equivalent to the difference in height. But you don't often hear that argued for why they're not hired in certain roles. There are a lot of arguments for why women aren't hired in certain jobs that don't stack up as well as this claim does. So just one to bear in mind when we're talking about all these things. And thank you for listening.
Very much, Lottie, and yes, I've forgotten how brave you're being, giving this talk in front of a whole bank of your former teachers. That was absolutely fascinating talk. There must be some questions or points from discussion. Pupils first. Patrick.
How, in your opinion, how much do you think kind of the differences in men and women come down to the environment they grow up in, and how much do you think comes down to actual physical and genetic differences?
Yeah, so that is the ultimate golden question in our research, which everyone is dying to answer, and it's extremely complicated. My personal answer is a bit of a cop-out. I think it's always both. I think you can't really tease them apart very easily. We desperately try to tease them apart in experiments, and there are hundreds of scientists out there doing really good jobs of really trying to hone in when it is biology and when it's the environment. But there's a bit of a movement to really try and not do this kind of false dichotomy of it's either biology or it's environment, because they obviously interact all the time and affect each other. So trying to how culture and biology kind of feedback on each other a lot as well is going a lot in our field. For things specifically like the mental rotation task, I would personally put my bet on it being more about kind of development and how boys and girls are kind of, how their schooling and their development goes that way. Because there are some interesting studies looking at if you just get girls to practice a lot of these kinds of tests, then they do end up reaching the same level as boys. And the confidence thing, I think, is a huge thing. So one of my studies in my PhD did look at the effect of confidence on mental rotation, and it was linking to an idea called stereotype threat. So this idea that if you're reminded of a stereotype about your group, then you'll perform worse because you're kind of demotivated or underconfident. So if girls are reminded you're bad at maths, then they might perform worse than if they were told actually girls and boys are the same at maths. So there's this idea, but the literature is quite confused and it's hotly debated. So the jury's kind of still out for mental rotation, but I personally feel like confidence and schooling and things definitely has a role to play, whether it's the whole picture. I don't know if we'll ever be able to say, but yeah.
Is it, if you, it's possible, there are such people that exist, they're called feral children, people not brought up, it's not a comment on anyone, people who are brought up sort of not in a social context, who are not given ideals by their parents. So much as we like to think there is an intrinsic human morality, these studies seem to suggest that's not the case. You get your ideals. You have to be given your ideals by people around you.
Yeah.
If you speak to people who teach in Jerwitz, they say that the difference between boys and girls seems to appear very early on.
I think it does, and they've even, one study that I saw that was really quite telling was putting infants, so before they could walk, so maybe the age of around one or something, dressed them in girls and dressed them in the opposite clothes and gave them to a stranger, but in this experiment someone came in and were told this is Lucy and she was wearing a pink dress and whatever, when in fact he was called John and he normally wears blue clothes, whatever. So they sat down and said, play with Lucy with whatever you want, and they had an array of toys, some boy typical, some female typical, and they were all spaced, completely equally and the same for everyone. And the adult did, when you looked back over the video recording, they assumed Lucy wants to play with the doll and assumed and made Lucy, but he was actually John, taking their real names, play with the doll and things. And they were happily playing away with the doll. They're like, oh, she wanted to. It's like, well, he's the boy and he's called John. So I think it's not anyone's fault. It's not parents and it's not society deciding we want girls and boys to be different. I think it's just a kind of accident of history, different things going on historically, and now we've got to a point where we're striving for equality and everything, and there are still these hangovers, and you just assume, a little girl wants to play with a doll. That's a perfectly, harmless thing to assume, but perhaps we need to kind of try and, there are all these pushes about supermarkets not having blue and pink toys and things. So I think if we start...
So you can't educate out the difference in the risk-taking thing?
I think you probably... That is a hard one, because risk-taking is a thing that generally across the animal kingdom seems to be quite robust as well. But I think you probably could definitely reduce the difference with society and education. Lots of women love rock climbing and extreme sports and things, but you don't see it a lot on TV, you don't see it in the media. There's a really good film festival called She Extreme, and it's all about women doing skateboarding and rock climbing and skydiving and stuff, and you realise when you see them, you don't ever see women in those situations where they're hanging off the edge of a rock with a hard hat on and stuff. You see men in those adverts with the aftershave or whatever hanging off a rock. I think that is playing a role. I think it's playing a role, but obviously proving that scientifically is very difficult. So.
Do you think that, you know the condition that's 5, is it 5 ARD?
Oh yeah.
Do you think that if they were female, if they said that they were female, do you think that they should compete in events as a female when they clearly have like a higher testosterone level? Do you think that's fair?
That's a really good question and a really interesting point. I can't remember what the incidence is of that particular disorder, but it's relatively low, even though it's bizarrely high in those places. I guess if you identify as a female and you want to compete as a female, I think you should be allowed to, because all females have varying testosterone levels and receptors and enzymes of different functions anyway. I think, having to genetically screen everyone before an event would be a bit, I don't know. But I think probably compete as whoever you want to compete as, because there's individual variation in everything. I don't know if that's a good answer or not, actually.
Fair enough. Charlie?
You highlighted there are some key differences between the neural pathways between males and females. Do you feel like, from people with poor mental health, do you feel like there should be a different approach to counselling them? Or do you think kind of the overall rule of thumb between the two is sufficient?
Do you mean between men and women there should be a different
Yes.
approach?
Do you feel like you should treat them differently, specifically because of this difference?
Probably not because of these particular studies of brain differences, because everyone's brain is different, everyone's experience is different, so trying to account for different, not 100% sure if they're there or not, is going to be an issue. But I think definitely using, brain images and using knowledge that we have about people's brains and particularly how people with mental health problems may perceive the world. Even, people with autism, we're learning more and more all the time about what their difficulties include and don't include and how they perceive things. And I think taking that on board whenever you're giving any sort of counselling or help is always going to be beneficial. But yeah, I wouldn't base too much on the kind of one brain study, because again, it's just a sample of 900 people. Is still quite a lot, but it's not everyone. So. Yes.
So you showed that great slide with the connectome at the beginning, with the men's hemispheres being more connections within and women's across, and then you said maybe not because of experience. Does that link in any way to language development in children? Because that tends to be faster in girls than boys. I don't know how robust that is.
That is
acquisition of speech.
That is really interesting. I don't know much about language. I didn't cover language too much in my PhD, but I am actually applying for some grant money to look at language more now. So that is really interesting, because there are sex differences in verbal fluency, and that girls tend to be better at boys, and the size of their vocab and the amount of different words they can think of to come up with the same concept, and whether obviously language does seem to reside in specific parts of the brain. But there was a recent study that seemed to say that actually language skills are kind of scattered all over the brain, and a lot of it all boils down to kind of domain general sequence learning. So again, so complicated, I don't know, but maybe there is some difference there, because there are differences in girls' and boys' language abilities, so maybe there is some brain stuff going on there.
This one going back a bit, you talk about the study where if you dress a baby up or a toddler up like they're a girl, people will treat them like a girl and vice versa. Is this an issue then that conformity is really an adult problem, and the adults are then teaching the children, and the child was perfectly happy to play with whatever toys that whichever adult gave them, and conformity is learned then later, and that perpetuates from generation to generation?
Yeah, so I have a bit of stuff on conformity in case someone asks, which maybe doesn't exactly answer what you're saying, but my previous supervisor and the PhD student previous to me did a lot of studies looking at conformity. And in the kind of work we do, where we're looking at social learning, when you learn from others and when you learn individually, we don't always see conformity as a negative thing, because if you go to a new environment and you don't know what to do and you don't know what the best thing is, then it would make sense to conform, do what everyone else does because they're surviving. It's probably useful. But obviously, yeah, conformity can sometimes be detrimental, and it can sometimes be the wrong thing to do. And there were studies using the mental rotation task, in which each participant did one of the mental rotation tasks and then measured afterwards their confidence on whether they thought they got it right or not. So how likely do you think you were to have got that one right? Measure it and then carry on. And of course, as usual, men were more confident than women. But after they'd done the task, they were then given the option to change their mind. So they would say, how confident are you? And then they would see the task again and say, okay, well, you said this, but 8 out of 10 people actually said the opposite. Do you want to change your mind? And females were way more likely to conform, to change their mind to the majority, but it was moderated when you looked at the statistics and all of the patterns and all of the data. It was actually predicted by their confidence levels. So obviously, if you have lower confidence, you're more likely to conform. This graph kind of shows that. So the bottom is the x-axis is the proportion of demonstrators who are disagreeing. So how big? So was it just half the people disagree with you, or was it like 99% of people disagree with you? And then their confidence levels are up here. So 7 is very confident, 1 is not confident at all. And this is the proportion that they switched their answers, the probability that they actually conformed, that they actually did the opposite. And you can see that as their confidence decreases, the likelihood of them conforming massively increases. And this was found again by another study a few years later, doing basically exactly the same thing. And then I repeated it in a slightly different way, but basically this bit was exactly the same. Oh, my graph's not there. But we found the same thing again and again. It's really, really robust. That women are conforming more because they have lower confidence on the task. And so they've now, my old supervisor is working with another guy who's now in the States, modelling this idea of if you have a population of half men, half women, and the men tend to all do these kinds of jobs, and the women tend to all do these kinds of jobs, if you just plant a tiny seed of you're slightly more likely to do what your sex does, then you see these whopping great big differences emerge when you model it. In the jobs and the occupations that men and women are tending to do. And so this is all, it does have actually pretty major implications for things like in the workplace, when women might be conforming more because they have less confidence, and men are the ones standing out and being innovative or coming up with new ideas and things. And there's some kind of really depressing studies as well about reference letters and CVs, so the kinds of adjectives that are used to describe men and women in reference letters. Men, it's usually, genius, innate ability, talented, all that kind of stuff that you can't change. And women's is like they work really hard, they're motivated, they try hard, and it's all about, they can work hard versus they're naturally talented. And with CVs, if you blank out the name or you give the opposite name on the CV and you give it to a panel of men and women, both men and women are more likely to hire the man, even though they have identical CVs. So even this was done in a controlled experiment, and it was the only thing that was different was a male or female name. So it's a thing that everyone does by accident. Like, no one wants there to be inequality. I think maybe some people out there do, but no one wants there to be this difference in careers. But I think it's just an accidental thing that we're kind of all guilty of at some point. Assuming that the boy or the girl is worse or better at a thing. So.
Thank you, Lottie. Time has run away with us, I'm afraid. But if you want to ask questions of the speaker individually, you can do so. Just a few announcements. First of all, I hope you put your name in the sign-up book. Secondly, Lottie is staying for a marvellous Barraclough supper. We'll be in the small Barraclough. Informal. If you want to continue your discussion, please do so. Don't forget next week, Healthcare in the News by the sixth form. Let me know if you want to come. I think it'll be a good evening. And finally, I'd like to ask Odette Muller to propose a vote of thanks. Let's come to the front, please, Odette.
So on behalf of all the students, all of the students that are here from Oakham School, I would very much like to express my gratitude to our great speaker, Dr. Charlotte Brand, for her intriguing and very interesting talk. What I found especially interesting or important to me as a feminist is that it's not as simple to say that because of the physical appearance of someone you can predispose them to a certain job or to certain traits in their attitude, but that there is so much more, and that it's not just biology or societies that forces somebody to be a person that they are, but that there's just so much more to it. But also, right from the start of the talk, I found it so interesting that the perception of different cultures, as for example in the Dominican Republic or Papua New Guinea, that it just changes so much by gender, so we really see that culture still influences perception, but also feminism, sexism, So, once again, I would just very much like to thank her for being with us today and spending this very educational evening with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Come and have a word with Lottie if you want to. I'll turn the video recorder off now.